As always, it is a great honour to stand in this House representing the people of Timmins James Bay, and today particularly with my colleague from Abitibi Bay James, Inuit Innu, to also be speaking with the support of the survivors who are watching this Parliament to do the right thing. Madame la Présidente, aujourd'hui, c'est un moment historique pour le Parlement du Canada. C'était le Parlement du Canada qui était établi la Commission de réconciliation et vérité, afin d'examiner les preuves et les documents et les témoignages concernant l'époque des écoles pensionnats. Et durant cette enquête, la Commission a reconnu que si les politiques du Canada et l'Église catholique, à ce moment-là, a représenté un génocide. Le mot génocide, c'est un mot très spécifique et très important. Pourquoi la Commission a déclaré le système des écoles pensionnats un génocide? Madame la Présidente, c'est clair. Dans la définition de génocide, les politiques d'arracher de force les enfants de leur famille, afin d'effacer leur identité, représente un génocide. Donc, c'est essentiel pour le Parlement du Canada de répondre aux commissions, en particulièrement pour inviter le pape François de participer avec nous dans cette rue de réconciliation. Et nous sommes très confiants aujourd'hui que le pape puisse comprendre l'importance de ces motions-là, parce que le pape, il a une vision de réconciliation et justice par tout le monde. Et c'est nécessaire pour le pape de jouer un rôle positif et proactif avec le Parlement du Canada et aussi avec les communautés autochtones de faire une excuse formelle. Madam Speaker, in beginning this morning, I want to say I never talk about faith or my own personal faith in the House. I don't believe it's appropriate. I feel that politicians cheapen faith often when they use it. But I want to say when Pope Francis was appointed, how thrilled I was, because he was a Jesuit. And I've had the great honor in my life of being influenced and knowing Jesuits. The great Jim Webb learned the cooperative movement in Cape Breton and worked in the Third World and worked in the inner cities of Toronto. Father Martin Royackers, murdered by gangs in Jamaica standing up for the homeless. Father Michael Czerny, who married my wife and I, who went into El Salvador in the face of the death squads to defend the poor. And what I learned from the Jesuits, as that Christian faith is not good enough to be charity, it has to be systemic. It's about changing the systems that keep people down. And so I am very confident that Pope Francis, who has spoken up on justice around the world, will hear the call of the Parliament of Canada and the cry of Indigenous people to do the right thing now and close this dark, horrific chapter. I want to say that I've been appalled by the line that I heard from the Canadian bishops, where they tried to evade their role in working with us on reconciliation. And we will talk today about the collusion of the federal government and the church, and that they have followed a pattern time and time again of defending, of covering up, of hiding for each other, and it all comes back to liability. It all comes back to money. Do you think the survivors are here for money? Oh, Madam Speaker, when you talk with the survivors of St. Anne's Residential School, who suffered such depravity, such horrors, and you see their dignity, They're not here for money. They're here. As one said to me last night, I came 12 hours to hear 3 words. That's what this is about. They've shown more reconciliation in the face of legal obstructions and challenges and the horrific crimes. As one said to me, if you could imagine the worst horror movie that you could ever make and put children in it, that wouldn't begin to cover what happened at St. Anne's Residential School. And that was done through the deliberate policy and the collusion. And we're going to talk about that. And it's not just about St. Anne's, but I'm speaking about St. Anne's because I know the survivors and it's in my region. I want to say, speaking of not just about money, the Hill Times said, Pope Francis, who has worked to make compassion and justice the guiding light of his pontificate, would be more at home with the survivors of St. Anne's Residential School than the Canadian bishops who appear to care more about the wallet than the gospel. Amen. Amen to that. So let's talk about how this started. What we learned was that the policy was established to destroy the Indian people in our country. That is the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation. Duncan Campbell Scott articulated the policy. I want to get rid of the Indian problem. That is the whole point. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. There is no Indian question and no need for an Indian department. That was the policy. And they worked hard to achieve it. In 1892, they issued the Order in Council on funding, where they established what was the bare minimum that you could spend to keep a child alive. And then they ensured that the money that they gave the churches was at least 25% lower than that. And the results were horrific death rates. And Peter Henderson Bryce was a civil servant who saw the death rates in Western Canada and was appalled. He articulated a 24% death rate, which was higher than the death rates of Canadian soldiers going into the trenches in Flanders. But at the Fife Hill Residential School, 69% death rate among children. Overall, a 40% death rate. These were death camps. But Peter Henderson Bryce began to expose it, and because he exposed it, it forced the government to make changes. And he wasn't the only one speaking up. There were church leaders who spoke up. I think of Samuel H. Blake of the Missionary Society of the Church of England, who was horrified by the treatment of the children. And he wrote to Archdeacon Timms, who ran the Industrial Indian School in Calgary, and he said, how can you be satisfied with statistics which show that of 900 to 1,000 children which pass through our schools, 300 of them pass out into the grave within 12 years? I cannot conceive, except upon this hypothesis, that we have grown callous amid such a frightful death rate. And in 1945, an American writer who was analyzing Canada's Indian policy said it as simply as you could get it. The government's policy is the extinction of Indians as Indians. And that's why we're here. Because for the Catholic Church to state in 2018 that the Catholic Church as a whole was not involved in the running of the residential schools veers dangerously into the road of historical revisionism. Because it was the bishops who promoted the policy, it was the bishops who oversaw it, and it was the bishops who worked hand in hand with the federal government and covered up at every step of the way. You know, the documents that they seized in the St. Anne's investigation, and I want to thank the Ontario Provincial Police for the incredible work they did standing up and insisting that the documents be received. And they took those documents from the orders, and they found documents that went all the way to the Curia Generalisa in Rome about the crimes at St. Anne's. The Vatican was involved. The Church of Canada was involved. The bishops were involved. They had a practice called bleeding the children to feed the mother house, where the minimum monies that were given by the federal government to the residential schools, the orders took a tax so that they could pay for their amenities in the mother house of the church. And they think they're worried about liability. Oh, Madam Speaker, they got off scot-free. Woe to those who would put such burdens when they had the obligation to do right. And today, the Catholic Church is involved very deeply, very deeply. Because it's cold comfort for the survivors of St. Anne's Residential School to know that the church has access to all the documents. The church has access to the names of all the survivors who've been so brave to come forward. The church gets to oversee that as the defendant. So for the church to be surprised that we're here, that's not good enough. Because it is the call of what we're doing today is the call from Isaiah, that we are called to be the repair of those broken streets and broken city walls, to restore communities to dwell in. Because as Edmund Matatawaban said, we're not here for reconciliation. We are here for reclamation, to rebuild our communities, to rebuild our children and our grandchildren so that they can move forward. They're not here for the money. They're here for something to do right. So in the time I have left, it's important that we talk about the role of complicity. And I want to speak today of John Keoki, 14 years old, from Attawapiskat. Michelle Matinis, 12 years old, from Attawapiskat. Michelle Sutherland, from Winisk, who was 12 years old, who never came home. There were many children who never came home from St. Anne's. And when I went in to those communities, they asked me what happened to our uncle, what happened to our cousin. And we found out that these boys were so desperate to escape the criminal abuse that was happening that they took their lives in their hand in April 1941 when the James Bay rivers are overflowing and tried to find their way home. And they never got there. And Father Langlois, Paul Langlois, told the children to keep their mouths shut about what had happened at the school. And I mention this because it was a year later that the federal government found out about the deaths of these children, and they didn't call the school. They called the bishop. They called Bishop Belleau. And they said, why did you cover this up? And he said, those boys were deserters. So the bishops oversaw this. And I want to read you from a letter of 1968 from teachers who were hired at St. Anne's Residential School, because there were good teachers, there were good brothers, there were good nuns. But you know what happened? They were always pushed out because they weren't cruel enough and they weren't sick enough to stay in those institutions. So 6 teachers went to St. Anne's and they were fired. And they wrote to Jean Chrétien. And they said they were told by the Department of Indian Affairs that it was easier to replace the teachers than to deal with what was happening at St. Anne's. And the teacher's handwritten letter, she said, although we may have not understood the implications of working at a mission school, we were employed by the Department of Indian Affairs. And she begged Jean Chrétien. She said, if there's anything to do to help these Indian people and help these helpless children, do it. She said to go back into that institution would give up basic beliefs in human rights and dignity and still face the children who are forced to live in such a sterile, rigid, unloving atmosphere. And why do I mention that? Because the children had no voice. They had no one to go to. The government of Canada was not going to help them. And at the same time, and imagine if the government had, because some of the most brutal crimes and abuses were happening then. And I refer you to an Ontario Provincial Police document from that time, where the children of St. Anne's approached Bishop Laguerriere at a big event to tell him about the sexual abuse, because they had no one else to go to other than the bishop. And they sat with him and they told him, and this is the OPP document, and the bishop told them that it was the fatherly way. And what we know now, of course, is that Bishop Jules Laguerriere was one of the most prolific predators. And when the federal government was told to turn over the documents for the IEP for the St. Anne's survivors, the government turned over a persons of interest report on Reverend Father Jules Laguerriere that was 1 page long. It was his biographical information, same when he was at St. Anne's. It wasn't until the survivors started demanding answers that it turned out that the government was sitting on a person of interest report referring to this bishop that was 3,191 pages long, describing the crimes he committed. The same with the person of interest report for Reverend Father Arthur Lavoie that had a 2-page report supplied to the independent assessment process, which included brief notes. But it did not include the fact that the federal government and the church both had the documents on Father Lavoie that listed his crimes running 2,472 pages long. Or Sister Anna Wesley, and her person of interest report is 6,804 pages long. And the children had no one to go to. They were in the hands of these sadists. That is why we're here, to do the right thing, to say this was a policy, this wasn't accidental. The fact that these people were protected, that they got away with it, and they've been still getting away with it even beyond the grave. Because the survivors of St. Anne's Residential School have had their cases thrown out because these documents were not supplied. And they're asking for closure. And you know, we talk about the financial indemnifications. All the Christian orders have been involved in the formal apologies. All the Christian orders paid their share. And you know, you could use the legal weasel words, well, certain dioceses weren't involved, but the greatest amount of money that came from the Anglican Church came from the Diocese of Toronto, where they had no residential schools. But the Anglican people of Toronto knew they had an obligation to do the right thing. And the Catholic Church was ordered to pay its share. And most of it was supposed to be monies in kind. Really? After all that? We don't really have any clue of how much of that monies in kind was ever paid, but we do know they were obligated to pay a $25 million payment. And they walked away on it from a legal loophole. And I'm not blaming the Conservative or Liberal government on this. There was a legal loophole, and they walked on that. And we have no legal power in the church, in Parliament, to tell the church to pay. But my God, this is a moral obligation, to pay what you owe, because you got off scot-free from the crimes that were committed, not just at St. Anne's, but around this country. It's about doing the right thing. And we find the issue of these documents, these letters, this proof that validates what these survivors went through and survived. These documents mean something. And this is why the Truth and Reconciliation called on each of the orders and each of the Christian faiths to turn over those documents, to turn over the photos. Because, you know, we have children who were taken away and never came home, and there's not even a record of them. You know, Madam Speaker, I was in Martin Falls on the 100th anniversary of the signing of Treaty 9, and we went up the river to where the original Duncan Campbell Scott came in his canoe to sign with the people at Agoki Post. And on that 100th anniversary, a man stepped forward and he started to speak in Ojibwe, and he apologized. He apologized that he didn't speak English. And he said, I never learned to speak English because they came and they took my sister and they never brought her home. And nobody ever told us what happened. So the next year when the white man came, his parents hid him in the bush. And they hid him year after year after year every time the white men came to take those children. And I think of that man. I think of his family. And I think of what kind of faith that I grew up in, where my aunts were nuns and they were powerful women of justice. And I think of the mercy that was shown me, and that nobody ever even came home and told this family, we took your daughter. We died. She died. She's in some unmarked grave someplace. Nobody even had the decency. Those are the crimes that have to be atoned for. So today, Madam Speaker, is a good day. It's a hopeful day. It's a day that we come to terms with what was done through the collusion of the church and the state working hand in hand to try and destroy an Indian identity. And I will say in closing, that identity has not been destroyed. That identity is stronger than ever, and that identity is, those people are watching like a jury over this Parliament to say, do the right thing and admit the wrongs, and then we can move on. Miigwech.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And what I'd like to do is go to the Truth and Reconciliation report. And if we look at Recommendation 58, this is what it states. We call upon the Pope to issue an apology to survivors, their families, and communities for the Roman Catholic Church's role in the spiritual, cultural, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children in Catholic-run residential schools. Madam Speaker, there is a great expectation in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation report. I believe we have a government through the Prime Minister, the Minister responsible, that have actually talked a great deal about that reconciliation. We understand the expectations of Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, Madam Speaker. And I'm wondering if my colleague can maybe just share his thoughts in regards to the expectations that people have in general in regards to how important that report actually is. Those, I believe, 94 recommendations.
The Honourable Member for Timmins James Bay.
I want to thank my honourable colleague, a colleague that I often have a very combative relationship in the House, and I want to thank him for his work representing his party. And the fact that today we are all called as parliamentarians for something bigger than any of us individually and bigger than our individual parties. We have a reckoning with history today, and that reckoning began when former Prime Minister Stephen Harper stood in this House and made that apology, and that was the proudest day of my life as a parliamentarian to hear that. And out of that, the agreement that was signed by then Prime Minister Stephen Harper on the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement that set us on this road, and part of that was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And Senator Sinclair and the commissioners did such a powerful job of gathering what was really hard testimony. And so many people came forward. And when the findings came out, people I know wept. People I know, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, told me they wept for days because to hear it spoken, to see that it put in print was a moment. And so part of that call was the Truth and Reconciliation calling on us today to do what we're doing, which is to reach out to the Pope. We are doing the work of Parliament that was given the mandate through the Truth and Reconciliation. So this is our job to finish the work of the Truth and Reconciliation, and we can do that today. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Kamloops Thompson Caribou.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I also want to thank my colleague for his very powerful words that he shared in the House today. You know, as we've been having this conversation, I know some people reflect on what happened in 2009, which I believe was an important moment in terms of the AFN and others meeting with the Pope. I wonder if you could share why this is also important, because some people might say, well, wasn't there an apology in 2009? But I think there's a significant difference in terms of what we're asking today versus, you know, certainly an important moment in 2009, but did not really provide the resolution that was needed.
The Honourable Member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you. I want to thank my honourable colleague who I have great respect for, and we've served on the Indigenous Affairs Committee together. And I thank her for that question because it is really important. I had the honour to be at the investiture of Pope Benedict, and he talked about the growing deserts of injustice and how we are all called to fight back against the desertification of injustice. And when he met with Phil Fontaine in the AFN, he gave a heartfelt